I never thought I would be standing in my own driveway, holding a stack of legal documents while my neighbor screamed at me about my wheelchair ramp being an eyesore that violated community standards. But there I was, Kyle Warner, a 34-year-old software engineer who had just moved into what I thought would be my dream home in Riverside Estates, a gated community in Henderson, Nevada, only to discover that my new HOA president had made it her personal mission to make my life a living nightmare. The whole mess started about 3 weeks after I closed on my house. I had been in a motorcycle accident 2 years prior that left me with significant mobility issues. I could walk short distances with a cane, but for anything beyond that, I needed my wheelchair. My house came with steps leading up to the front door, so the first thing I did after moving in was hire a contractor to build a compliant accessibility ramp. It was professionally done, matched the color of my house, and met all ADA specifications. I thought I had done everything right. That was before I met Brenda Patterson. Brenda was the HOA president of Riverside Estates, a woman in her late 40s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and the kind of personality that made you want to check if all your belongings were still there after talking to her. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my ramp installation was completed, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested she had just discovered someone had planted weeds in her perfect garden. "Mr. Warner, I presume," she said, not waiting for me to confirm before launching into her prepared speech. "I am Brenda Patterson, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association. I am here to inform you that your recent exterior modification is in direct violation of our community covenants, conditions, and restrictions." I leaned against my door frame, confused. "I'm sorry, what exterior modification?" She gestured dramatically toward my ramp. "That unsightly structure attached to your front entrance. You did not submit the proper architectural review request forms before installation, and even if you had, I can assure you it would not have been approved. It significantly detracts from the uniform aesthetic we have worked very hard to maintain in this community." "That's my wheelchair ramp," I said, feeling my blood pressure starting to rise. "I'm disabled. I need it to access my home." Brenda's expression did not change. She simply flipped through the papers on her clipboard. "Be that as it may, all exterior modifications require board approval. You have violated Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the CC and Articles. You have 30 days to remove the structure and restore your property to its original condition." "You want me to remove my wheelchair ramp?" I could not believe what I was hearing. "That's illegal. The Fair Housing Act protects my right to make reasonable accommodations." She gave me a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Warner, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the documents you signed when you purchased your home. This is a private community with strict standards. The Fair Housing Act does not supersede our governing documents. You agreed to abide by our rules when you moved here." "Actually, that's not how the law works," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Federal law supersedes HOA rules when it comes to disability accommodations." Brenda's smile vanished. "We shall see about that. You have 30 days. Good day, Mr. Warner." She turned on her heel and walked back to her white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing there in shock. I went inside and immediately started researching. Everything I found confirmed what I already knew. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, as amended, specifically protected the rights of disabled individuals to make reasonable modifications to their homes. An HOA could not legally prevent someone from installing necessary accessibility equipment. I thought that would be the end of it. I drafted a formal response letter citing the relevant laws, attached documentation from my doctor confirming my disability, and sent it via certified mail to the HOA board. I figured once they consulted with their lawyer, they would realize they were on the wrong side of the law and back off. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was even more aggressive. Not only did they reject my documentation, but they also informed me that I was now being fined $200 per day for every day the unauthorized structure remained on my property. They also demanded that I move my wheelchair to my garage when not in use because it was visible from the street and detracted from community aesthetics. I read that letter 3 times, each time getting angrier. They wanted me to hide my wheelchair. They wanted me to pretend I was not disabled because my medical equipment was apparently offensive to look at. That evening, I called my sister, Grace Fulton, who lived in Phoenix. She worked as a paralegal for a civil rights law firm and had always been my go-to person for legal advice. "Kyle, this is insane," she said after I read her the letter. "They cannot do this. This is textbook discrimination." "I know," I said, rubbing my temples. "But what do I do? They're threatening to put a lien on my property if I do not pay the fines." "First, do not pay anything," Grace said firmly. "Second, you need to document everything. Take photos, save all correspondence, keep records of every interaction. Third, you need to get a lawyer, a good one. This is going to get ugly, Kyle." "I just wanted a nice house in a safe neighborhood," I said, feeling exhausted. "I did not sign up for this." "I know, honey, but you cannot let them bully you. What they are doing is not just wrong, it is illegal. Let me make some calls." I know some attorneys in Nevada who specialize in housing discrimination cases. True to her word, Grace connected me with an attorney named David Chen, a partner at Morrison & Associates, a law firm in Las Vegas that handled civil rights cases. I met with him the following Monday at his office downtown. David was in his mid-40s, sharply dressed, and had the kind of focused intensity that immediately made me feel like I was in good hands. He listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "This is a strong case," he said when I finished. "The HOA has violated your rights under both the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The fact that they are fining you daily and demanding you hide your wheelchair makes it even worse. That shows a pattern of discriminatory behavior." "So what do we do?" I asked. "First, I am going to send them a cease and desist letter on behalf of the firm, informing them that their actions constitute illegal discrimination and demanding they immediately stop all fines and harassment. Second, we are going to file a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Third, if they do not back down, we are going to file a lawsuit in federal court." "How long will this take?" David leaned back in his chair. "It depends on how reasonable they want to be. If they are smart, they will back down immediately and settle. But based on what you have told me, I suspect your HOA president is not going to be reasonable. So realistically, we could be looking at several months, possibly longer." I felt my stomach sink. I cannot afford months of legal battles. "You would not be paying out of pocket for most of it," David explained. "Housing discrimination cases often result in the defendant paying attorney fees if we win. Plus, you could be entitled to damages for emotional distress, violation of your civil rights, and any actual damages you have incurred. We can also seek an injunction to stop them from continuing their discriminatory practices." I thought about it for a moment. The idea of a prolonged legal fight was exhausting, but the idea of letting the HOA push me around was worse. "Let us do it," I said. David smiled. "Good. I will get started on the paperwork today." The cease and desist letter went out the next day. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would scare some sense into Brenda and the HOA board. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. 3 days after the letter was delivered, I came home from work to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was a formal notice of violation hearing scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I was being summoned to appear before the HOA board to answer for my continued violations of community standards. "They are doubling down," David said when I called him. "This is actually good for us. It gives us more evidence of their discriminatory intent. I want you to go to that hearing, and I want you to record it if Nevada is a one-party consent state, which it is. Document everything they say." The hearing was scheduled for 7 in the evening. I showed up at 6:55, my wheelchair equipped with a small recording device I had purchased specifically for this purpose. The community clubhouse was a modest building near the entrance of the subdivision, with a large meeting room that could hold about 50 people. When I rolled in, Brenda was already there, along with 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them as neighbors I had seen around the community, but never spoken to. They all sat behind a long table at the front of the room, looking for all the world like they were presiding over a criminal trial. About a dozen other residents were scattered throughout the audience, apparently there to watch the spectacle. I recognized a few faces from the neighborhood, including my next-door neighbor Tom, who gave me an encouraging nod when I entered. "Mr. Warner, thank you for attending," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false courtesy. "Please position yourself in front of the board." I wheeled myself to the spot she indicated, feeling like I was on trial for some terrible crime rather than simply trying to access my own home. "Let us begin," Brenda said, shuffling papers importantly. "Mr. Warner, you are here tonight because you have repeatedly and willfully violated the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of Riverside Estates. Despite multiple notices and warnings, you have refused to remove an unauthorized exterior structure from your property. Additionally, you have been observed storing unsightly equipment in your driveway and front yard area. How do you respond to these charges?" "Charges," I said, unable to keep the incredulity out of my voice. "Brenda, we are not in court. And I have already explained that my wheelchair ramp is a legally protected accommodation under federal law. You cannot force me to remove it." "We most certainly can," said one of the other board members, a man in his 60s whose nameplate read Richard Stokes. "You signed a legally binding contract when you purchased your home agreeing to abide by our community standards. Those standards exist to protect all of our property values. Federal law supersedes your CC and Articus," I said, trying to remain calm. "The Fair Housing Act specifically protects my right to make reasonable modifications for my disability." Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "You keep mentioning this Fair Housing Act as if it is some kind of magic shield. Let me be clear, Mr. Warner. This board has consulted with legal counsel, and we have been assured that our enforcement actions are entirely proper. Private communities have the right to maintain their standards." That was interesting. Either their lawyer was incompetent, or they were lying about consulting one at all. I suspected the latter. "Then your legal counsel is wrong," I said. "And if you continue down this path, you are going to end up costing this HOA a lot of money in legal fees and damages." Another board member, a woman named Patricia Holmes, leaned forward. "Is that a threat, Mr. Warner?" "It is a fact," I replied. "I have already retained an attorney who specializes in housing discrimination. We have sent you a cease and desist letter. If you do not stop these violations of my civil rights, we will file a federal lawsuit." The room got very quiet. Some of the residents in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Brenda's face had turned an interesting shade of red. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. How dare you come into this community and threaten us with lawsuits because you think you are above the rules? We have worked for years to maintain the standards of this neighborhood, and we are not going to let you turn it into some kind of junkyard because you refuse to keep your medical equipment out of sight. My medical equipment is my wheelchair, I said, my own anger rising now. You are literally asking me to hide the fact that I am disabled. Do you understand how discriminatory that is? Oh, here we go, Brenda said, throwing her hands up dramatically. The discrimination card. Let me tell you something, Mr. Warner. Nobody here cares about your personal situation. What we care about is property values and community aesthetics. If you cannot abide by our rules, perhaps you should consider moving somewhere more appropriate for your needs. The room erupted. Several residents started talking at once. Tom, my neighbor, stood up and said, "Brenda, that is way out of line. The man has a right to access his own house." Another resident, an elderly woman I did not recognize, said, "I think Brenda has a point. We all agreed to certain standards when we moved here. Why should he get special treatment?" "It is not special treatment, it is the law," someone else shouted. Brenda banged her gavel, which I had not even noticed she had. "Order! We will have order at this hearing." "This is not a hearing, it is a kangaroo court," I said loudly, "and I am done participating in it. You have been warned about the legal consequences of your actions. When you get served with a federal lawsuit, do not say nobody told you this was coming." I turned my wheelchair around and headed for the door. Behind me, I could hear Brenda sputtering something about fines and enforcement actions, but I did not stop. I rolled out of that clubhouse with my head held high, even though my hands were shaking. The next morning, I sent the full recording to David Chen. He called me 2 hours later. "Kyle, this is gold," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "They basically admitted on the record that they want you to hide your disability because it affects their precious aesthetics. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. I am filing the lawsuit today." "How bad is it going to get?" I asked. "For you, it might get worse before it gets better. They are going to retaliate, probably escalate the fines and harassment. But for them, this is going to get very, very bad. I am not just going to sue the HOA as an entity. I am going to name Brenda Patterson individually for her discriminatory conduct. When this is over, she is going to wish she had never heard your name." David was right about the retaliation. Within a week of filing the lawsuit, I received a notice that my daily fines had been increased to $500. I also got a citation for having unauthorized window treatments because apparently the blinds I had installed were half an inch wider than allowed under the CC and Articus. Then they cited me for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours on collection day, even though the trash truck had been late. It was absurd, transparent harassment, and David documented every single bit of it. The lawsuit, filed in the United States District Court for the District of Nevada, was comprehensive. David sued under both the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, seeking injunctive relief to stop the HOA's discriminatory practices, compensatory damages for emotional distress and violation of my civil rights, punitive damages, and attorney fees. He also filed for a temporary restraining order to immediately stop the fines and harassment pending the outcome of the case. The hearing for the temporary restraining order was scheduled for 3 weeks after we filed the complaint. In the meantime, my life became increasingly stressful. The HOA sent someone to photograph my property almost daily, looking for new violations to cite me for. Brenda started sending letters to my employer, claiming I was running an illegal business from my home because I worked remotely and occasionally had video conferences. They were grasping at straws, but it was still exhausting to deal with. My neighbors were split. Tom and a few others were supportive, occasionally stopping by to check on me and express their disgust with the HOA's behavior. But others clearly sided with Brenda, giving me dirty looks when I was outside and making comments about how I was destroying the neighborhood and costing everyone money with this frivolous lawsuit. The preliminary hearing was held before Judge Margaret Holland, a no-nonsense jurist in her late 50s with a reputation for not tolerating foolishness in her courtroom. David had prepped me extensively on what to expect, but I was still nervous as we took our seats at the plaintiff's table. The HOA was represented by a lawyer named Gerald Hutchins, a man in his 60s who looked like he had been practicing law since before I was born. Brenda was there too, sitting directly behind the defense table, her face set in an expression of grim determination. Judge Holland reviewed the filed documents, then looked up at both attorneys. "I have read the complaint and the motion for a temporary restraining order. Mr. Chen, make your argument." David stood, confident and composed. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of disability discrimination. My client, Kyle Warner, is a disabled individual who installed a wheelchair ramp to access his home, which is his legal right under both the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The defendant HOA has not only attempted to force him to remove this necessary accommodation, but has also fined him thousands of dollars and demanded he hide his wheelchair from public view because it is allegedly unsightly. This is textbook discrimination, and it needs to stop immediately." Judge Holland turned to the defense table. "Mr. Hutchins, your response." Gerald Hutchins stood slowly. "Your Honor, this case is not about discrimination. It is about the rule of law and the enforcement of private contracts. When Mr. Warner purchased his home, he voluntarily agreed to abide by the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Those CC and Articus require architectural review and approval before any exterior modifications. Mr. Warner simply ignored that requirement and installed his ramp without permission. The HOA has a duty to enforce its governing documents equally against all residents. The Fair Housing Act provides an exception for necessary disability accommodations," David interjected. "The HOA cannot enforce its CC and Articus in a way that discriminates against disabled individuals." "But the HOA is not discriminating," Hutchins argued. "They are simply requiring the same compliance they would demand from any homeowner who made an unauthorized modification." Judge Holland held up her hand. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Hutchins. If a non-disabled resident had installed, say, an unauthorized decorative fountain, would the HOA be demanding they remove it and fining them $500 per day?" Hutchins hesitated. "The fine structure is outlined in the governing documents, Your Honor." "That is not what I asked," Judge Holland said sharply. "Has the HOA ever imposed a $500 per day fine on any other resident for any other violation?" The silence that followed was telling. "I would need to check the records," Hutchins finally said. "I think you should do that," Judge Holland said dryly. She turned to David. "Mr. Chen, do you have the recording from the HOA hearing?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I have provided a transcript in our filing, and I have the audio recording available if the court wishes to hear it." "Play the relevant portions," Judge Holland ordered. David pulled out his laptop and played several clips from the hearing, including Brenda's statement about me being above the rules, and her suggestion that I should move somewhere more appropriate for my needs. He also played the part where she said nobody cared about my personal situation and that they only cared about property values and community aesthetics. Judge Holland's expression grew darker with each clip. When the recording finished, she looked directly at Hutchins. "Mr. Hutchins, you are going to tell me with a straight face that this is not discriminatory." Hutchins looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson was understandably frustrated during that hearing. Her words may have been poorly chosen, but that does not change the fundamental legal issue at stake." "The fundamental legal issue," Judge Holland said coldly, "is that your clients have violated federal anti-discrimination law and are continuing to do so. I am granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is hereby ordered to immediately cease all fines, penalties, and enforcement actions against Mr. Warner related to his wheelchair ramp and wheelchair. They are also prohibited from taking any further retaliatory action against Mr. Warner pending resolution of this case. Do I make myself clear?" "Your Honor, the HOA has a right to enforce its governing documents," Hutchins protested. "The HOA does not have the right to violate federal law," Judge Holland shot back. "Mr. Hutchins, I strongly suggest you advise your clients to settle this case before it goes any further. Because if this goes to trial, and I hear more evidence like what I have heard today, the damages are going to be substantial. This court will not tolerate discrimination of any kind, and certainly not discrimination against disabled individuals trying to access their own homes." She banged her gavel. "The temporary restraining order is granted. We will schedule a status conference for 60 days from now to assess whether this case is moving toward settlement or trial. Court is adjourned." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. David squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "That went about as well as we could have hoped." As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave, I glanced back at the defense table. Brenda was whispering furiously to Hutchins, her face red with anger. She caught my eye, and the look she gave me was pure venom. Outside the courthouse, David and I stood in the bright Nevada sunshine, reviewing what had just happened. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait," David said. "The restraining order gives us leverage. The HOA has two choices: settle this case on terms favorable to you, or go to trial and risk a massive judgment against them. Most HOAs would choose to settle, but based on what I have seen from your HOA president, I would not be surprised if she convinces the board to keep fighting." "What would a settlement look like?" "At minimum, they would have to agree to stop all enforcement actions against you, formally acknowledge your right to keep your ramp and wheelchair without restriction, reimburse any fines you have already paid, pay your attorney fees, and probably pay you some amount in damages for emotional distress. We might also require them to implement anti-discrimination training for the board and revise their policies to ensure this does not happen to anyone else. And if they do not settle," David's expression turned serious, "then we go to trial, present all the evidence of their discriminatory conduct, and ask a jury to award you compensatory and punitive damages. Given how bad the facts are for them, we could be looking at a significant judgment. 6 figures, possibly more. But trials are unpredictable, and they take time and emotional energy. Settlement is usually the better option if we can get reasonable terms." Over the next 2 weeks, life started to improve. The daily fine notices stopped. Nobody came to photograph my property looking for violations. The harassment letters ceased. It seemed like the restraining order had finally gotten through to the HOA board, but I knew Brenda well enough by now to suspect this was just a temporary pause. I was right. About 3 weeks after the restraining order, I received a call from David. "Kyle, I just got a settlement offer from the HOA's attorney," he said. "That is good, right?" "It is insulting," David said bluntly. "They are offering to drop all fines against you and agree not to pursue any enforcement action regarding your ramp. That is it. No damages, no attorney fees, no policy changes. Basically, they are offering to stop doing the illegal thing they were never allowed to do in the first place, and they want us to be grateful for it. What did you tell them? I told them to go to hell, in slightly more professional language. I sent them a counter offer. We want $50,000 in damages. Full attorney fees, which are currently around $30,000 and climbing. A formal written apology from the board, mandatory anti-discrimination training for all board members, and a revision to their policies explicitly stating that disability accommodations are permitted without architectural review. I also told them if they do not accept within 2 weeks, the settlement offer goes up. Do you think they will accept? Honestly, I do not know. A reasonable HOA board would jump at this offer. It saves them from a trial they are almost certainly going to lose badly. But from what I have seen, Brenda Patterson is not reasonable, and she seems to have the rest of the board under her thumb. The 2 weeks came and went with no response from the HOA. David filed a motion to move the case toward trial. We began the discovery process, which meant both sides exchanged documents and information relevant to the case. During discovery, we hit gold. The HOA was required to turn over all of their records related to architectural review requests and enforcement actions for the past 5 years. What we found was damning. In the past 5 years, the HOA had received over 200 architectural review requests for various modifications. Everything from new paint colors to garden sheds to solar panels. Of those 200 requests, only 12 had been denied. And of those 12 denials, 11 had been resolved when the homeowner made minor modifications to their plans. The only outright rejection that resulted in enforcement action was mine. Even better, we found records of at least 30 unauthorized modifications that the HOA had discovered over the years. In every single case except mine, the enforcement process involved a friendly letter asking the homeowner to submit a retroactive architectural review request, followed by approval with perhaps a small fine of $50 or $100. Not a single other homeowner had been fined $500 per day or threatened with a property lien. This proves selective enforcement, David explained when he showed me the documents. They treated you completely differently than every other homeowner, and the only distinguishing factor is your disability. This is exactly what we need to prove discrimination. We also deposed several members of the HOA board. Most of them were clearly uncomfortable and gave vague, evasive answers. It became obvious that Brenda had been driving the enforcement action against me, and the other board members had simply gone along with it, either out of fear or apathy. Then came Brenda's deposition. David had warned me that I could attend if I wanted, but it might be frustrating to watch. I decided to go anyway. I wanted to see Brenda squirm. The deposition was held at Morrison & Associates conference room. Brenda showed up with Gerald Hutchins, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. A court reporter was there to record every word. David started with basic background questions, establishing Brenda's role as HOA president and her involvement in my case. Then he started to dig deeper. Mrs. Patterson, when you first saw Mr. Warner's wheelchair ramp, what was your reaction? I noticed it was not consistent with the architectural standards of the community, Brenda said stiffly. Did you know at that time that Mr. Warner was disabled? The ramp made it fairly obvious. And did it occur to you that a disabled person might need a ramp to access their home? I was aware of the purpose of ramps, yes, but you still demanded he remove it. I demanded he follow the proper procedures for architectural review, like everyone else. David pulled out a document. I am showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 14. This is an email you sent to the other board members 2 days after you first saw Mr. Warner's ramp. Could you read the highlighted portion out loud? Brenda's face paled slightly as she read the document. I would prefer not to. Please read it for the record, David said calmly. Brenda glanced at her attorney, who nodded reluctantly. She read in a flat voice, I am concerned that if we allow Warner to keep his ramp without going through proper channels, other residents will think they can do whatever they want. We also need to consider the aesthetic impact. These kinds of modifications can make the neighborhood look like a rehabilitation facility rather than a luxury community. A rehabilitation facility, David repeated. What did you mean by that? I meant that we need to maintain certain standards. Standards that do not include visible evidence of disability. That is not what I said. But it is what you meant, is it not? David leaned forward. You did not want Mr. Warner's ramp visible because it reminded people that a disabled person lived in your luxury community. Objection, Hutchins said. Argumentative. I will rephrase, David said smoothly. Mrs. Patterson, did aesthetic concerns play a role in your decision to demand removal of the ramp? Aesthetics are part of our review process for all architectural modifications. But Mr. Warner never had the opportunity to go through that review process, did he? You never asked him to submit plans for approval. You simply demanded he remove the ramp immediately. Brenda did not answer. Mrs. Patterson, please answer the question. I believed it was obvious the ramp would not be approved, so there was no point in going through the formality of a review. You prejudged his request based on your own bias against disability accommodations, David said. Objection, Hutchins said again. The deposition went on for 4 hours. By the end, Brenda looked exhausted and furious. David had gotten her to admit several damaging facts. That she had never dealt with a disability accommodation request before, that she had not consulted the Fair Housing Act before making her demands, that aesthetic concerns had been a primary factor in her decision, and that she had personally set the $500 per day fine amount because she wanted to send a strong message. After the deposition, David was practically glowing. That was even better than I hoped. If this goes to trial, the jury is going to hate her. So what happens now? I asked. Now we wait for them to realize how screwed they are and come back with a real settlement offer. It took another 3 weeks, but eventually they did. Gerald Hutchins called David and requested a settlement conference. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at a local business center. The HOA was represented by Hutchins and 2 board members, though notably not Brenda. David and I sat across from them. My clients are prepared to make a reasonable offer to resolve this matter, Hutchins began. They will agree to drop all enforcement actions, pay $20,000 in damages, and cover reasonable attorney fees up to $15,000. David did not even pause. Not even close. Our demand is $75,000 in damages, full attorney fees which are now at $42,000, a written apology, mandatory training and policy revisions. We are also adding a new condition. Brenda Patterson must resign as HOA president. One of the board members, a man named Stephen Cartwright, spoke up. We cannot force a board member to resign. She was elected by the community. Then the community can vote to remove her, David said, or she can choose to resign voluntarily. But my client will not accept any settlement that leaves her in a position of power where she can continue to discriminate against him or anyone else. This is outrageous, Hutchins sputtered. You are trying to dictate the internal governance of a private association. No. We are trying to protect disabled residents from a discriminatory HOA president, David shot back. Your client has a choice. settle on these terms or go to trial and risk a much larger judgment plus the cost of a trial. I have seen the discovery materials. I have deposed your board members. I know exactly how bad this is going to look to a jury. The meeting ended without agreement, but I could see the board members were rattled. 2 days later, Hutchins called back with a revised offer. $60,000 in damages, full attorney fees, written apology, training, and policy revisions. But they still refused to require Brenda's resignation. Counter at $65,000 and we will drop the resignation requirement, I told David. I just want this over with. David negotiated back and forth over the next week. Finally, we reached an agreement. The HOA would pay me $65,000 in compensatory damages, cover all attorney fees and costs totaling $45,000, issue a formal written apology signed by all board members, implement mandatory Fair Housing Act training for all current and future board members, and revise their policies to explicitly allow disability accommodations without architectural review. Additionally, though we could not force Brenda to resign, the settlement required the board to send a notice to all residents explaining what had happened and informing them that residents had the right to petition for a special election to recall board members. It was not everything I wanted, but it was a solid victory. The settlement was finalized in early June, about 7 months after Brenda first showed up at my door demanding I remove my ramp. The HOA's insurance company cut the checks, and I received a formal letter of apology that, while clearly written by a lawyer, at least acknowledged that they had violated my rights and committed to doing better in the future. The notice to residents went out a week later. I did not see it myself, but Tom brought a copy over to show me. It was surprisingly candid, explaining that the HOA had been sued for disability discrimination, had lost, and had paid over $100,000 in damages and legal fees as a result. It outlined the policy changes being implemented and informed residents of their right to call for a recall election. People are furious, Tom told me. Not at you, at Brenda and the board. Most people had no idea this was even happening. Now they are finding out their HOA fees are going up to cover the cost of this lawsuit, all because Brenda decided to pick a fight she could not win. 3 weeks later, a group of residents submitted a petition for a recall election of the entire HOA board. The election was held in July. Brenda and 2 other board members were voted out. Stephen Cartwright and 1 other member kept their seats, but they were clearly on thin ice. The new board president was a woman named Lisa Hernandez, a retired teacher who ran on a platform of transparency and following the law. One of her first actions was to reach out to me directly to apologize and assure me that I would never face discrimination from the HOA again. "What happened to you was wrong," she said when we met for coffee, "and it should never have happened. I want you to know that this board is committed to making Riverside Estates a welcoming community for everyone." "I appreciate that," I said. "I never wanted to be the guy who sued the HOA. I just wanted to live in my house in peace." "Well, now you can," Lisa said with a smile. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The daily stress of dealing with HOA harassment faded. I settled into my house, made some actual friends in the neighborhood, and even started to enjoy living in Riverside Estates. I ran into Brenda one more time, about 3 months after the settlement. I was getting my mail when she drove past in her white Lexus. Our eyes met for a brief moment. She looked older, tired, and bitter. I felt a flash of something that might have been pity. She had brought all of this on herself through her own prejudice and stubbornness, but I doubted she would ever see it that way. The money from the settlement allowed me to make some other improvements to my house, things I had been putting off. I upgraded my home office setup, did some landscaping, and even installed a pool lift so I could use the community pool more easily. I submitted the architectural review request for the pool lift as a courtesy, though it was not legally required. The new board approved it in 3 days with an enthusiastic note saying they were glad I would be able to enjoy the community amenities. I also used some of the money to make a donation to the Nevada chapter of the Disability Rights Legal Center, the organization that David had recommended I contact when we first started the case. They had provided resources and support throughout the legal battle, and I wanted to pay it forward. My sister Grace flew out to visit that fall. We sat on my back patio, enjoying the October weather and reflecting on everything that had happened. "You know, I am proud of you," she said. "You could have given up, you could have moved, but you stood your ground and fought for your rights." "I had good help," I said, raising my beer in a toast. "Still, it took courage. A lot of people would not have done it." "I did not really have a choice," I said. "If I had let them push me around, what kind of message would that send? That disabled people should just accept discrimination? That we should hide away and make ourselves invisible so we do not offend anyone's delicate sensibilities? No, I had to fight back." Grace smiled. "Well, you definitely won. How does it feel?" I thought about that. "Honestly, it feels good. Not just because I won money or made Brenda lose her position. It feels good because I stood up for myself and proved that the law is on the side of disabled people, even when some petty tyrant with a clipboard thinks otherwise. And hopefully, the next disabled person who moves into this neighborhood will not have to go through what I went through." "That is the real victory," Grace agreed. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt genuinely content for the first time since moving to Riverside Estates. My house was truly my home now, complete with all the accommodations I needed to live independently and comfortably. No one was going to take that away from me. The legal battle had been exhausting and stressful, but it had also taught me something important. I had rights, and those rights mattered. The Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act were not just words on paper. They were powerful tools that protected people like me from discrimination. And when someone tried to violate those rights, there were consequences. Brenda Patterson had learned that lesson the hard way. The HOA had learned it too, to the tune of $110,000, plus the humiliation of being publicly exposed for discriminatory practices. But more importantly, they had learned that disabled people would not simply accept being pushed around. We would fight back, and we would win. In the months that followed, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda had sold her house and moved out of Riverside Estates entirely. I did not know where she went, and I did not particularly care. She was no longer my problem. The new HOA board, under Lisa's leadership, turned out to be reasonable and competent. They focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. They repaved the roads, upgraded the playground, and organized community events that brought neighbors together. The atmosphere in Riverside Estates changed noticeably. People seemed friendlier, more relaxed. I even joined the HOA's social committee, helping to plan events and activities. It was strange, going from being at war with the HOA to being an active participant in it, but it felt right. This was my community too, and I wanted to help make it better. One evening, about a year after the settlement, I was sitting on my front porch when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking around the neighborhood with the excited nervousness of potential home buyers. They noticed me and waved. "Hi there," the woman called out. "We are thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood. Do you like living here?" "I do now," I said with a smile. "It is a good community. The HOA is reasonable, the neighbors are friendly, and they respect everyone's rights. The man noticed my wheelchair ramp. That is actually something we wanted to ask about. My wife uses a wheelchair sometimes. Have you had any issues with accessibility? Not anymore, I said. The HOA learned their lesson about disability discrimination. You would not have any problems. We chatted for a few more minutes. I gave them my honest assessment of the neighborhood, including a carefully edited version of what had happened with the previous board. I wanted them to know that the community was welcoming now, but also that disabled residents had legal protections if anyone tried to discriminate against them. As they drove away, I felt satisfied. This was what I had fought for. Not just my own right to access my home, but the right of every disabled person to live where they chose without facing discrimination or harassment. The wheelchair ramp that had caused so much trouble still stood at my front door, as solid and functional as the day it was installed. But now it was just a normal part of the landscape, barely worth a second glance from anyone passing by. That was exactly how it should be. My medical equipment was no longer something I had to hide or apologize for. It was simply part of my life, as unremarkable as anyone else's furniture or appliances. I kept my wheelchair in the garage when I was not using it, not because anyone demanded it, but because that was convenient for me. I had made my stand, fought my battle, and won my victory. The scars of that fight would probably never completely fade. There were still moments when I felt anxious about HOA notices in my mailbox, still times when I wondered if someone was going to complain about something related to my disability. But those moments became less frequent as time went on and the new normal established itself. The settlement money sat in my bank account, most of it anyway. I had spent some on home improvements and the donation to the legal center, but the bulk of it remained. It was not money I had wanted. I would have much preferred to just move into my house without all the drama and conflict. But since I had been forced to fight for my rights, at least I had been compensated for the emotional distress and violation of my civil rights. David Chen and I stayed in touch. He occasionally sent me news articles about other housing discrimination cases he was working on. Each time, I was reminded of how common this problem was. Disabled people faced discrimination in housing all the time, whether from HOAs, landlords, or other entities. Many of them did not have the resources or support to fight back. I had been lucky to have a sister with legal connections and to find an attorney willing to take my case. That was why I eventually decided to become more active in disability rights advocacy. I started volunteering with local organizations, sharing my story at community events, and even testifying before the state legislature on proposed bills related to housing accessibility. If my experience could help prevent someone else from going through the same ordeal, then something good would have come from all the stress and conflict. Looking back now, I can see that the battle with Brenda and the HOA was a turning point in my life. Before that, I had largely accepted my disability as something to work around, to manage, to minimize. I tried to be as normal as possible, to not call attention to my limitations. The wheelchair was something I used when necessary, but tried not to think about too much. But fighting for my right to have a wheelchair ramp forced me to confront my disability head-on. It made me realize that I had nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to hide. My disability was part of who I was, and I had every right to live my life with the accommodations I needed. If other people had a problem with that, that was their issue, not mine. That realization was liberating. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, for needing accommodations, for being visibly disabled. I stopped trying to make myself smaller or less noticeable to make other people comfortable. I existed, I had rights, and I was not going to apologize for either. The Americans with Disabilities Act had been passed in 1990, more than 30 years before my battle with the HOA. The Fair Housing Act amendments protecting disabled individuals had been enacted even earlier, in 1988. These laws had existed for decades, yet discrimination persisted. Cases like mine happened every day across the country. HOA, landlords, and other entities still tried to force disabled people to hide their accommodations, to make themselves invisible, to pretend their disabilities did not exist. But every time someone fought back and won, it reinforced the power of these laws. It sent a message that discrimination would not be tolerated, that there were consequences for violating people's civil rights. My case was just one of thousands, but it mattered. It mattered to me. It mattered to the next disabled person who moved into Riverside Estates. And it mattered to anyone who heard the story and realized they did not have to accept discrimination either. As I sat on my porch that evening watching the sun set over the desert mountains, I felt genuinely at peace. The fight was over. I had won. My home was truly mine, and no one could take that away from me. The wheelchair ramp stood solid and secure, a symbol not just of accessibility but of resistance. It represented my refusal to be pushed aside, to be hidden away, to accept second-class treatment. Every time I rolled up that ramp, I was reminded that I had fought for my rights and won. And that was a feeling no amount of money could buy.